In this recording, we're going to look at a variation on an Android app from just a previous example. So in that example, we used Volley to make an Android app that read a JSON file from the internet. And this is going to do the same, but the JSON file is going to be of a slightly different structure. So we want to point out the differences when the JSON file has a different structure. So this one, as it says here, Volley JSON start square. So this is the URL for the example. And at the end, it says JSON start square. And if a JSON file starts with a square bracket, that means that the overall object, or the overall entity in the JSON is an array. And the previous example started off with a curly bracket. So the overall entity was an object. So that's the difference in this example. I'll probably sort of repeat most of the blah, 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 but that is the main difference if you've seen that previous example. Okay, so this is the URL for the example that can be downloaded. Okay. So we did some work in the Gradle to announce that we're going to be using Volley and Picasso to show. Picasso is going to show an image, and Volley we're going to use to read that JSON file, which is going to be off the internet. Since we're using the internet, we edited the Android manifest to say that we want permission to use the internet, and we are using this attribute that allows us to use HTTP and not just HTTPS. That depends on some of the settings of the app, whether how secure they set up. But if you have a high security setting, this will allow this particular app to use the HTTP protocol. Okay, in the activity main, we have a spinner. We're going to have a bunch of Harry Potter movie titles in the spinner. We're going to have information displayed, the text view that says director, and then a place to display the director. The same for writer and producer, and the music, an image view to display a movie poster that's going to be on the internet. And so we are going to have a URL for the image. We're going to use Picasso for that. And then a button, and that's going to allow us to start a new intent and go over to YouTube and display a movie trailer. Okay, so now on to the code. So this is a variation on the previous example, and the difference is in the JSON file, and then some differences in the code to correspond to that change. So in this, here's the JSON file we're going to be reading this time. And it starts with a square bracket. So the overall thing is an array, and then it is an array of objects. So within the square bracket is a curly bracket, and then these key value pairs, title, colon, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, director, Chris Columbus, etc. So that is the difference. Previously, it started with a curly bracket. This time it's starting with a square bracket. And so we're going to see a few changes based on that. So we're going to use Volley, and Picasso. And these are just some comments to, if you just sort of started here, reminding you to sort of edit the Gradle so then we can use Volley and Picasso and edit the manifest so we have the right permissions. Connect to the interface, so get a version of the spinner, text views for the director, writer, producer, music, an image view for the poster, a button to display the trailer. Here is the URL. It's just again, this slightly different URL. There's a base URL. It's the same base URL, and the images are in that location. So in this location, if I take away that and just go to the base location, we have the poster images as well as the JSON files. So we're reading the JSON file. It starts with a square bracket, so it starts with an array. And then we have this base URL, which is where the images are going to be found. Going to have a JSON array of the information in the JSON file, and we're going to have a sort of parallel array of simple strings to use with the spinner. We're going to use Volley to make our request and to say how we want to respond, how we want to act when we get a response to that request. Okay, and here's the big difference. Before when we got the response, we were asking for a JSON object. In the previous example, now we're asking for a JSON array, all because of how the file starts. This file starts with a square bracket, that's array, so we're making a JSON array request. We're using the get method of HTTP interactions. We have above the URL, the JSON request null, and then we set up the response listener. When we get the information back, when Volley brings the information back from the internet, what do we want to do? So then the response this time is a JSON array. So previously it was an object, and then we had to extract from that object the array of interest. But now this time it starts with that array, and so the response is the array. And then from there on, it's mostly the same, but let's just go through it in case you haven't seen the previous example. I'm looping through that JSON array, getting the ith object and grabbing the title and adding that to this parallel array of film titles that I'm going to use to populate a spinner. So I'm making an array adapter. Here's my array of film titles and a layout, so what I want them to look like, and the context, and I make an array adapter, and then I use the array adapter as the adapter of the spinner that loads up the film titles. Then I'm going to make the spinner event. I'm going to do an on item selected listener. I'm responsible for two methods. One is on nothing, and I'm doing nothing when nothing is selected, but when the item is selected, and I usually work with the view and this I, which I'll just call the index. The view is what the user was seeing, then we'll cast it as a text view. That's what the user was seeing was text, and then we can access the text. So view is just a very generic thing, but to grab the text from it, we cast it as a text view. And then we get the text and convert it to a string and put it in a toast. I find more useful if I have arrays, as I do array lists. Then I find it more useful to have the index I. I'm getting from my array the ith object, and then I'm getting the director, writer, producer, music properties and putting them in the corresponding text views. And I'm taking the image property of the ith object and adding my base URL and using Picasso to display the image in the image view. So way over there somewhere is IV poster, put it into the image view poster. There was a button. So here's the on-click listener for the button. We're finding from the spinner, which one is chosen, the selected item position. And then I'm getting the YouTube code property from that ith object and then adding, that was just a YouTube code, and then adding the base URL to watch a movie, to watch a video on YouTube, plus the YouTube code that we had in the JSON file, concatenate that together, and then use that as a new intent. So go over and watch the trailer. So this is all what I've said I want to do when I get a response from the JSON array request. Starting here in line 128, this is if I get something went wrong and there was no response, then I'm just taking the error and casting it as a string and putting it into a toast to display the error. And here's the end of the request. And then I must add my request. Again, it's a JSON array request this time. And that is the big difference between this and the previous example, where the previous one was a JSON object request. This is an array request, but I must add my request to my request queue or nothing happens. So again, the big difference was in this example, then it was an array rather than an object that we were getting. And so we see that here in 81 that we're making the array request. In the previous example, we had to get the array from the response, but in this example here in 88, the response was the array. And then down here, we must add that request to the request queue. Okay, that's what I wanted to show you in this example. Thanks for your attention.